Fargo, North Dakota, May 19, 2023. Jason Hartford, a 45-year-old lawyer, was found dead in the backyard of his suburban home, discovered near the pool. Authorities initially ruled it as a tragic accident, but whispers around the community hinted at something darker. His wife, Karen Hartford, had been battling a chronic illness for years, a fact that would prove to be the key to unraveling the truth. Jason had built his life on appearances, a successful career, a beautiful home, and a young mistress on the side. But behind the facade was a man who was willing to do whatever it took to free himself from a marriage he no longer wanted, even if it meant letting his wife's illness take its course. What he didn't count on, however, was Karen's resilience, her ability to uncover his secrets, and her willingness to take justice into her own hands. Jason and Karen Hartford lived in Fargo, North Dakota, in a picturesque neighborhood where every yard seemed to compete for perfection. To those who knew them, they were the couple that had it all. Jason, a 45-year-old defense attorney, was a star in the courtroom, his name synonymous with winning even the toughest cases. Charismatic and confident, he was the kind of man people gravitated toward. Karen, on the other hand, was his quieter counterpart. She was the steady force behind the scenes, running their home with care and supporting Jason's demanding career, even as she battled lupus, an illness that had slowly reshaped her life over the past 5 years. To outsiders, they were a dream team. Jason's colleagues admired his drive, and neighbors often commented on Karen's resilience and grace. Even as her illness progressed, she worked tirelessly to maintain their household, never complaining and always smiling through the pain. But the Hartford household wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Behind closed doors, Karen began to sense changes in her husband that made her question the foundation of their seemingly unshakable bond. At first, the changes were small enough to dismiss. Jason started coming home later than usual, citing long hours at the office or late-night meetings with clients. Karen believed him. Why wouldn't she? His work as an attorney often required odd hours. But then the excuses became more frequent and the reasons less believable. He started paying more attention to his appearance, hitting the gym almost obsessively and replacing his old suits with an expensive new wardrobe. When Karen asked him about the sudden changes, Jason brushed it off with a charming smile. Just trying to keep up in a competitive field, he'd say. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. As Karen's health continued to deteriorate, her world grew smaller. The vibrant woman who once hosted dinner parties and organized neighborhood events now spent her days at home, her energy too sapped to maintain her old social life. Friends who used to drop by regularly became less frequent visitors, their calls and texts dwindling. Karen told herself they were busy, that life had simply moved on. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the isolation creeping in. Even Jason seemed to have drifted away. He stopped asking about her doctor's appointments, forgot small but significant anniversaries, and no longer seemed interested in spending time with her. One night, Karen decided to make an effort to reconnect. She cooked Jason's favorite dinner, hoping a quiet evening together would help bridge the growing distance. But when Jason walked through the door, his face didn't light up at the sight of her efforts. Instead, he mumbled something about being exhausted, barely touching the meal before retreating to his office. Karen sat alone at the table, the untouched food on his plate a stark reminder of how far apart they had grown. The tipping point came when Karen stumbled across a receipt from a high-end restaurant she'd never heard of. The charge was dated a night when Jason had claimed to be working late. She felt her stomach drop as she held the slip of paper in her trembling hands. When Jason returned home that evening, she confronted him, asking where he'd really been. He didn't miss a beat. "That was a client dinner," he said, his tone calm and measured. "You know how these things are. Why are you even asking?" Karen wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her husband, the man she'd built a life with, was telling the truth. But there was something in the way he spoke, too smooth, too rehearsed, that made her doubt him. Still, when he accused her of being paranoid, blaming her suspicions on the stress of her illness, Karen felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was overthinking things. But the seed of doubt had already taken root, and it wasn't going away. Over the following weeks, Karen couldn't stop herself from noticing every little thing. The late-night phone calls Jason quickly ended when she entered the room. The new cologne she didn't recognize. The way he seemed to be more preoccupied with his phone than with her. When she tried to bring it up again, Jason turned the conversation against her, accusing her of not trusting him. "Do you have any idea how hard I work to keep this family afloat?" he snapped. "The least you could do is have a little faith in me." Karen felt the sting of his words, but said nothing. She hated the way he made her feel, as if her concerns were irrational and her instincts untrustworthy. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Jason was hiding something from her. She decided that if he wouldn't give her the truth, she would find it herself. Quietly, she began to observe him more closely, taking note of his comings and goings, paying attention to the way he interacted with her and with others. The more she watched, the more the cracks in their marriage became apparent. Jason's once charming smiles now seemed hollow, his laughter forced. He was spending more time away from home than ever, and when he was there, he felt like a stranger. Karen longed to confront him again, but she held herself back. She knew Jason was a skilled lawyer, a man who could talk his way out of anything. If she accused him without proof, he'd only find a way to turn it against her. Karen made a quiet vow to herself. She wouldn't let her suspicions consume her, not without evidence. She would keep her eyes open and bide her time. If Jason was hiding something, she would find out eventually. For now, she played the role of the trusting wife, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally reveal itself. For nearly a year, Jason Hartford had been leading a double life. It all began with Lisa, a 21-year-old yoga instructor who had walked into one of the upscale fitness clubs Jason frequented after deciding to prioritize his health. Lisa was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. She was young, carefree, and full of life in a way that Karen couldn't be, not with the weight of her illness pressing down on her. Jason hadn't planned for it to happen, or so he told himself, but something about Lisa made him feel alive again. Their first encounter was innocent enough. Small talk after a class, a laugh shared over something trivial. But one thing led to another, and soon, they were meeting for coffee, then dinner, then nights spent in hotels Jason paid for with a credit card Karen didn't know about. Lisa wasn't just a fling. She was Jason's escape. He painted himself as a man trapped in a loveless marriage, burdened by the responsibility of caring for a chronically ill wife. He made himself out to be the victim, a devoted husband who stayed out of duty rather than love. "If it weren't for Karen's condition, I'd have left years ago," he'd tell Lisa, his voice heavy with fake regret. Lisa, naive and eager to believe the man who lavished her with attention and gifts, ate up every word. She felt sorry for Jason, convinced she was his chance at happiness after years of sacrifice. Things came to a head late one night when Karen woke up to find Jason missing from their bed. She heard the faint murmur of his voice coming from downstairs, his words too low to make out. Quietly, she crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Jason's tone was soft, affectionate, unlike anything she'd heard from him in months. Then came the word that confirmed everything. "Good night, baby," he said, followed by the sound of him ending the call. Karen felt her knees go weak. She wanted to march downstairs and confront him right then and there, but she stopped herself. Jason would just deny it again, twist the narrative to make her doubt her own sanity. Instead, she turned and went back to bed, her mind racing with questions. Who was baby? How long had this been going on? And why was Jason so willing to let their marriage fall apart while pretending nothing was wrong? The following days were a blur of frustration and heartache. Karen tried to dig deeper, searching for clues in Jason's behavior, but every attempt seemed to backfire. When she brought up her suspicions, Jason's reactions ranged from feigned hurt to outright anger. "I can't believe you'd accuse me of something like this," he'd say, shaking his head in disbelief. "After everything I do for you? For us." Even Karen's closest friends weren't much help. When she confided in them, they urged her to let it go. "Jason loves you," one friend had said. "He's under a lot of pressure with work. Don't make things harder for him." The dismissals left Karen feeling more isolated than ever. It wasn't just Jason who was making her doubt herself. Everyone around her seemed to believe his lies. But Karen knew what she had seen, what she had heard. The man she had trusted with her life was keeping secrets, and she was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. Karen's health, already fragile from years of battling lupus, began to deteriorate further. Fatigue seemed to cling to her like a shadow, and flare-ups became more frequent. At first, she thought it was just the natural progression of her illness, but small things started to feel off. Jason, who had once been so diligent about her care, started slipping in ways that didn't feel accidental. Her prescriptions, which he used to refill like clockwork, suddenly ran out, leaving her scrambling to get emergency doses. When she asked him about it, he would shrug and say, "I must have forgotten. I've been so swamped at work." The subtle neglect didn't stop there. Jason began encouraging her to cancel doctor's appointments, citing the cost or the inconvenience of fitting them into their schedule. "You've been going to these appointments for years," he'd say with a smile that felt more condescending than supportive. "We know what they're going to tell you. It's just the same old thing. Save yourself the trouble." Then there were the meals. Karen had always been careful about her diet, knowing that certain foods helped manage her symptoms. Jason had taken over cooking more often, something she initially thought was his way of supporting her. But her flare-ups grew worse after meals, and she began noticing small changes. He'd leave out key ingredients she relied on or substitute them with things she avoided. When she brought it up, Jason would act surprised. "I didn't think it would make a difference," he'd say, brushing her concerns aside. Karen began to suspect that these weren't innocent mistakes, but she had no way to prove it. The idea that Jason might be sabotaging her health was almost too much to bear, yet the evidence was hard to ignore. The man who once cared for her so deeply now seemed intent on quietly eroding her well-being. Meanwhile, Jason's life outside their home continued unchecked. His affair with Lisa had grown more serious, though the 21-year-old yoga instructor had no idea just how dark his intentions had become. To Lisa, Jason was a good man trapped in an impossible situation. He spun tales of a wife too sick to leave and a marriage he endured out of obligation. "She relies on me," he'd tell her, his voice heavy with feigned guilt. "If I left, it would destroy her." Lisa, naive and caught up in her feelings for Jason, believed every word. She began pressuring him to take the leap and leave Karen, assuring him they could build a life together without the burden of his unhappy marriage. But Jason always had an excuse. "You don't understand how complicated it is," he'd say, shaking his head. "If I left her while she's sick, it would ruin me. Everyone would see me as the bad guy." Jason's reluctance only made Lisa more determined. She saw herself as his escape, the person who could save him from a life of misery. But what she didn't know was that Jason wasn't just staying for appearances. He was staying because Karen's illness served his purposes. A sick wife was the perfect cover for his lies, and the last thing he wanted was for her to get better. Karen, for her part, began to sense that Jason's neglect wasn't coincidental. The missing medications, the canceled appointments, the worsening symptoms, it all started to form a pattern she couldn't ignore. She began documenting everything, keeping notes on every incident, every missed refill, every odd comment Jason made. Her instincts told her she was being manipulated, but every time she tried to bring it up with others, she hit a wall of disbelief. When she told her doctor that Jason was neglecting to refill her prescriptions, the response was sympathetic but dismissive. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," the doctor said. Chronic illness can be overwhelming for both patients and their families. Even her sister, her closest confidant, brushed off her concerns. "Jason's under a lot of pressure," she said. "You have to give him some grace. No one's perfect." The constant dismissal wore on Karen, leaving her questioning her own judgment. Was she really imagining things? Was she reading too much into Jason's behavior? But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Jason wasn't just neglecting her. He was actively undermining her health. The realization was both terrifying and empowering. For the first time in months, Karen felt a spark of clarity. She wasn't paranoid. She was being systematically broken down, and she needed to find a way to fight back. For now, though, she had no one on her side. Even her sister, the one person she thought would believe her, was convinced she was overreacting. Karen felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, shouting into the void, her voice swallowed by the wind. But she wasn't ready to give up. If no one else would listen, she'd have to rely on herself. Quietly, she began to plan. Karen's days blurred together in a haze of pain and fatigue, each one seeming harder than the last. But everything changed when a new doctor came into her life. Dr. Amelia Green had a reputation for thinking outside the box, and during Karen's first appointment, she listened with an attentiveness Karen hadn't felt in years. Dr. Green ordered new tests and adjusted Karen's medications, explaining that a subtle tweak in her treatment plan might make all the difference. At first, Karen was skeptical. She'd heard promises before, but within weeks, she began to feel something she hadn't in years: hope. The improvement was slow but undeniable. The crushing fatigue that had left her bedbound for days at a time started to lift. Her joints felt less stiff, and her mind, once fogged by exhaustion, began to clear. Karen didn't tell Jason right away. She didn't want to give him the chance to downplay her progress or sabotage her newfound strength. Instead, she played the part of the sick, dependent wife while secretly relishing the return of her independence. As her strength returned, so did her resolve. Karen began to see things with fresh eyes, the pieces of Jason's behavior clicking together in ways they hadn't before. His late nights, his disinterest in her well-being, his casual dismissals, they were all part of a pattern she could no longer ignore. She realized that if she wanted to protect herself, she'd have to be strategic. Jason had underestimated her, and Karen intended to use that to her advantage. With her newfound energy, Karen threw herself into gathering evidence. She started keeping meticulous notes about Jason's actions, the late-night phone calls he took in hushed tones, the credit card charges for restaurants and hotels, the way he conveniently forgot to refill her prescriptions. She even began recording their conversations, careful to hide the small digital recorder she'd purchased at an electronics store across town. Each night, she backed up the recordings to a secure cloud account, ensuring she had a record of everything. Karen's suspicions deepened when she stumbled across Jason's laptop one afternoon. He'd left it open on the kitchen counter while stepping outside to take a call. Karen hesitated for only a moment before clicking through his tabs. What she found made her blood run cold. Jason had been researching life insurance policies, specifically ones with high payouts for spouses with pre-existing conditions. Her name was on the application he'd partially filled out. Karen's hands trembled as she stared at the screen. The policy was for a staggering sum, far more than anything they'd ever discussed. She felt her chest tighten as the implications set in. Jason wasn't just neglecting her health, he was planning for her death. Whether he intended to hasten it or simply let her illness take its course, the outcome would be the same. Jason standing to gain a fortune from her demise. That evening, Karen decided to confront him. She waited until Jason was settled in his office, sipping a glass of scotch and scrolling through his phone. She walked in, holding a printout of the policy application she'd found. Jason looked up, startled but quickly masking it with a calm smile. "What's this, Jason?" Karen asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She held up the paper for him to see. Jason's expression didn't falter. "It's just a precaution," he said smoothly. "With your condition, I thought it would be smart to have something in place, for peace of mind." "For peace of mind?" Karen repeated, her voice sharpening. "You didn't think to discuss it with me first?" Jason shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't want to worry you. I figured it was better to handle it myself. I thought I was doing the responsible thing." Karen stared at him, searching his face for any sign of remorse, but there was none. If anything, his calm demeanor only deepened her suspicion. "How much were you planning to insure me for?" she pressed. Jason's tone turned defensive. "Why does it matter? I'm trying to protect us, Karen. You always assume the worst about me." Karen didn't respond. She knew arguing with Jason would get her nowhere. He was too skilled at twisting the narrative to suit his needs. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, her mind racing. Jason's nonchalance confirmed what she already knew. He didn't see her as his wife anymore. She was an obstacle, a means to an end, and possibly even a payday. The confrontation only strengthened Karen's resolve. She doubled down on her efforts, documenting everything and staying 2 steps ahead of Jason. She started meeting with a lawyer in secret, a woman recommended by Dr. Green, who was beginning to suspect there was more to Karen's struggles than her illness. Karen also reached out to a private investigator, providing him with the evidence she'd already collected and asking him to dig deeper into Jason's finances and activities. Despite the weight of what she'd uncovered, Karen felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't experienced in years. Jason had underestimated her, believing she was too weak, too sick, too dependent to fight back. But Karen was done playing the victim. She was done letting Jason control her life. Quietly, methodically, she prepared for the storm she knew was coming. Lisa always thought she knew Jason Hartford. He was everything she could have wanted. Charming, attentive, and endlessly charismatic. Their relationship had been her escape from the monotony of her day-to-day life, a secret romance that made her feel special. But cracks in Jason's carefully constructed facade began to show one night when she overheard a phone call that made her stomach churn. Jason had been at her apartment, pacing the living room while on the phone. Lisa had been in the kitchen, casually scrolling through her phone, but the change in his tone caught her attention. He sounded colder than usual, his words clipped and calculated. "She's not getting worse fast enough," he muttered, his voice sharp with frustration. "I can't keep doing this forever. Something needs to happen." Lisa's heart sank as she heard him say Karen's name. Her hands froze mid-motion as he continued, his words more venomous than she'd ever imagined. "If this drags out much longer, it's going to ruin everything. I need a way out." She backed away from the kitchen doorway, her pulse racing. The man she had thought was a loving, conflicted husband trapped in an unfortunate situation now sounded callous and unrecognizable. Who was he really? The next day, Lisa couldn't shake what she'd heard. Jason had always spoken about his wife's illness with sadness, lamenting how trapped he felt by her condition. But last night, there had been no sadness in his tone, only anger and impatience. Determined to get to the truth, she began to dig into his past. It didn't take long for everything to unravel. A few quick searches revealed inconsistencies in Jason's story. His financial situation, which he'd always described as stable, was anything but. Public records showed lawsuits and mounting debts. There were even whispers of an insurance policy he had taken out in Karen's name, one with a payout so large it made Lisa's stomach turn. Lisa's fury boiled over. She had been deceived, manipulated into believing she was helping a good man escape an impossible situation. But the Jason she had uncovered was not the man she thought she loved. He was a liar and possibly worse. When she confronted him later that week, Jason tried to charm his way out of trouble. "Lisa, you've got it all wrong," he said, his tone measured, his smile too perfect. "You don't understand the full picture." But Lisa wasn't buying it. "Don't insult me," she shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "You've been lying to me from the beginning. About Karen. About your money. About everything." Jason's calm attitude started to slip. "Lisa, I can explain." "No, you can't," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You're not the man I thought you were. Stay away from me. And if you ever come near me again, I'll go to the police." For the first time since their affair began, Jason looked genuinely unsettled. Lisa slammed the door behind him, cutting him off mid-protest, and leaned against it, shaking. She had walked away from Jason Hartford for good. Jason's desperation only grew after Lisa's departure. He tried to call her repeatedly, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between pleas for forgiveness and angry rants about her betrayal. Lisa didn't respond. At home, Karen noticed the shift in Jason's demeanor. He was more irritable, snapping at her over small things and spending even more time locked away in his office. His charm, once so polished, had dulled, replaced by a simmering anger that made Karen uneasy. Karen had been carefully observing him for weeks, documenting every suspicious action, every hostile remark. She knew Jason was unraveling, and his increasing desperation made her even more vigilant. Late one evening, as she worked quietly in the living room, Karen overheard Jason on the phone. He had closed the door to his office, but his raised voice carried through the thin walls. "We're running out of time," he said, his tone urgent and panicked. "I need this done, and I need it done now. I don't care how messy it gets." Karen froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved closer to the door, straining to catch more of the conversation. Jason was speaking in clipped phrases, giving orders to someone she couldn't identify. "It has to look natural," he said. "No loose ends. Understand?" Karen's breath caught in her throat. She stepped away from the door, her mind racing. Jason was planning something, and it was clear that whatever it wasn't good. She didn't know exactly what he was plotting, but she knew enough to realize she was running out of time. That night, Karen made the decision to accelerate her plans. She gathered her evidence, the recordings, the notes, the financial documents she had pieced together, and backed them up to multiple secure locations. She contacted her lawyer and the private investigator she'd hired, arranging a meeting to go over her findings. Karen didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced with questions, her thoughts jumping from one worst-case scenario to the next. She knew Jason was dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had spent too long under his thumb, too long letting him control her life. That time was over. The next morning, Karen moved with a quiet determination. She hid her emotions behind a calm exterior, careful not to let Jason sense her growing resolve. When he left for work, she made a call to the private investigator, giving him the green light to dig deeper into Jason's finances and recent activities. As the pieces of Jason's life continued to come together, Karen realized just how deep his deception went. His debts were far worse than she had imagined. His reckless spending funded by loans he had no way of repaying. The life insurance policy was just one part of a larger scheme, a desperate attempt to claw his way out of financial ruin. Despite the mounting evidence, Karen knew she had to tread carefully. Jason was becoming increasingly unpredictable, and she couldn't risk tipping him off. She stayed vigilant, keeping up the appearance of a woman too sick and too reliant on her husband to pose a threat. But inside, she was preparing for the battle of her life. By the end of the week, Karen had everything she needed. Her evidence was airtight, her plan carefully laid out. She didn't know how far Jason would go, but she was ready to fight back with everything she had. For the first time in years, Karen felt a sense of control, a flicker of hope that she could take back the life Jason had tried to strip from her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Jason Hartford had underestimated her, and that would be his greatest mistake. Karen spent weeks meticulously gathering evidence, quietly watching Jason as his lies and manipulations unraveled before her eyes. It had taken all her strength not to confront him earlier, but now the time had come. One evening, as Jason sat in the living room with his feet propped up on the coffee table, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world, Karen walked in holding a thick folder. Her pulse raced, but she kept her expression calm. Jason glanced up lazily. "What's that?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. Karen didn't respond right away. She set the folder down on the table and spread its contents in front of him. Photos, financial records, emails, and printed screenshots from his text with Lisa. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid everything out, but her voice remained steady. "It's everything," she said coldly. "Everything you've been hiding. Your affair, the life insurance policy, the lies, and the way you've been sabotaging my health. I know it all, Jason." Jason's face darkened. He leaned forward, scanning the documents, his jaw tightening. For a brief moment, Karen thought he might deny it all, but then he leaned back in his chair and let out a dry, bitter laugh. "So, you've been busy," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "And what do you plan to do with all this, Karen? Call the cops? Tell everyone how poor, sick you has been wronged by her big, bad husband?" Karen's anger flared, but she kept her composure. "I trusted you," she said. "I gave you everything, and this is what you do? Cheat, lie, and plan to cash in on my death? You're disgusting." Jason's laughter stopped. His smile turned into a sneer as he stood, towering over her. "You want the truth? Fine. I've been stuck in this miserable life for years because of you. Do you know what it's like, carrying someone like you? Every day, the same complaints, the same excuses. Your illness, your weakness, it's suffocating. I had dreams, Karen, a future, and you ruined it." The words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Karen felt her chest tighten, but she refused to show him how much he'd hurt her. "You could have walked away, she said quietly. But instead, you stayed and turned into this. A liar, a cheat, a coward. Jason's face twisted in anger. Walk away? Are you kidding me? You drag me through the mud. Take everything I've worked for. I'm not the bad guy here, Karen. You're the one who turned this marriage into a death sentence. Karen stared at him, her calm exterior masking the storm inside her. You'll get what you deserve, Jason, she said. Mark my words. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jason fuming. He shouted something after her, but she didn't stop to listen. Instead, she went to her bedroom and locked the door. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking as Jason's words replayed in her mind. Weak, suffocating, ruined. The cruelty of his confession pushed her to the brink. She realized then that no one would believe her unless she had concrete proof that couldn't be twisted or dismissed. Jason was too slick, too convincing. Even with the evidence she had, she knew he'd find a way to make her look paranoid or vindictive. She needed something undeniable. That night, while Jason slept, Karen packed a small bag. She grabbed essentials, a few changes of clothes, her phone, the digital recorder, and backup copies of her evidence. She left the originals hidden in a secure place, just in case. Before leaving, she sent a quick email to her lawyer, letting her know she would be unreachable for a few days. Then she slipped out of the house, careful not to make a sound. Karen didn't have a clear destination in mind. She just needed space to think, to plan her next move. She checked into a small motel on the outskirts of Fargo, paying in cash to avoid leaving a trail. The room was bare and unremarkable, but it was quiet, a welcome change from the tension that had consumed her home. The next morning, Jason woke to find the house empty. At first, he was confused. Karen's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of her anywhere. He searched every room, calling her name, but she was gone. For a fleeting moment, a pang of worry crept in, but it quickly gave way to smug satisfaction. She finally cracked, he muttered to himself. About time. Jason convinced himself that Karen had given up. Maybe she'd gone to stay with her sister, or booked herself into some wellness retreat to sulk. Either way, he thought, it meant she was out of his way for now. He spent the next few days enjoying the quiet, confident that he had one. But Karen wasn't hiding. She was preparing. By the end of the third day, Karen had a plan. She packed up her things and checked out of the motel, her resolve stronger than ever. Jason had underestimated her, believing she was too weak and too dependent to fight back. But he was about to learn just how wrong he was. As Karen drove back to the house, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know exactly how this would end, but one thing was certain. She was done being Jason's victim. It was time to take her life back, and she wouldn't stop until Jason's lies and manipulations were fully exposed. It was late when Karen returned to the house. The neighborhood was quiet, and the warm glow from the living room window cast long shadows across the front yard. She stood in the driveway for a moment, steadying her nerves. This was it. Everything she had prepared for was about to unfold. She took a deep breath, smoothed her coat, and walked inside. Jason was sitting on the couch, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching television. When he saw her, his eyebrows raised slightly, but he quickly masked any surprise with a smirk. Well, look who finally decided to come home, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I was beginning to think you'd left for good. Karen set her bag down and walked into the room, her expression calm. I needed some time to think, she said softly. About us. Jason leaned back, a smug smile spreading across his face. And what did you decide? She hesitated just long enough for him to savor his perceived victory before responding. I want to make this work, she said, meeting his eyes. I want us to start over, to fix what's broken. Jason chuckled, clearly relishing the moment. Well, that's a relief, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I knew you'd come to your senses eventually. Karen didn't flinch. She gave him a small, almost shy smile and said, I just need you to trust me, Jason. That's all I'm asking. Jason's confidence grew. He nodded, holding his glass up in a mock toast. To a fresh start, he said, before taking a sip. Karen watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and headed for the kitchen. "I'll be right back," she called over her shoulder. Jason stayed on the couch, sinking deeper into his own arrogance. In his mind, he had won. Karen was back, and whatever rebellion she tried to muster had clearly fizzled out. He didn't notice when she returned to the room, holding the folder of evidence she'd taken with her days earlier. Karen stood silently in the doorway for a moment, watching him. Then she spoke. "Jason," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We need to talk." Jason glanced at her, his smug expression faltering slightly when he saw the folder in her hands. "What now?" he asked, irritation creeping into his tone. Karen stepped closer, dropping the folder onto the coffee table in front of him. The papers spilled out, and Jason's eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight. "This is everything," Karen said, her voice calm but firm. "Every lie you've told, every step you've taken to sabotage me, to cheat me, to hurt me." Jason laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Karen, come on. We've been through this. You're making something out of nothing." "I'm not," Karen said, cutting him off. "I've sent copies of all of this to my lawyer, to friends, to people who won't dismiss me the way you always do." Jason's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his tone turning dark. "You think you can threaten me?" he snarled. "You don't have the guts to follow through on this, Karen. You never have. You're just a weak, sick woman trying to play a game you don't understand." Karen didn't react to his words. She simply stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You don't scare me anymore, Jason," she said. "You can't manipulate me, and you can't control me. You've already lost." Jason laughed again, louder this time, his arrogance bubbling back to the surface. "You're bluffing," he said. "No one's going to believe you. You're just a desperate woman grasping at straws." Karen picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder. She walked to the door, pausing only to glance back at him. "Enjoy your night, Jason," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Because it's going to be your last." Jason froze, his smirk faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "More empty threats?" he scoffed. "You don't have it in you, Karen." Karen didn't respond. She stepped outside, letting the door close softly behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Jason sat in the living room, staring at the folder on the table, a flicker of unease finally creeping into his mind. For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he was still in control. The morning after Karen Hartford's sudden disappearance, Fargo was jolted awake with shocking news. Jason Hartford, a prominent lawyer, was found dead in the backyard of his suburban home. His body lay near the pool, and the scene appeared consistent with a fall. An empty Scotch glass rested on the patio table, and his shattered phone was scattered a few feet away. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, a drunken misstep that had ended in catastrophe. When police arrived at the scene, they conducted their initial assessment, but it didn't take long for subtle inconsistencies to raise questions. A scuff mark on the patio near Jason's body didn't align with the supposed trajectory of his fall, and the phone appeared deliberately smashed rather than dropped. Neighbors soon offered another piece of the puzzle. They reported hearing a heated argument the night before between Jason and Karen. Shouting had echoed through the otherwise quiet neighborhood, punctuated by the sound of breaking glass and muffled crashes. Adding to the suspicion was Karen's sudden disappearance. Her car remained in the driveway, but she was nowhere to be found. A quick sweep of the house revealed that some of her belongings were missing, though not enough to suggest she had planned to leave permanently. There was no note, no explanation, just an eerie silence that only deepened the mystery surrounding Jason's death. As the investigation intensified, detectives began to piece together the narrative of a strained marriage. The neighbors' accounts of the argument were corroborated by forensic evidence. Near Jason's body, investigators discovered a heavy garden tool partially hidden behind a bush. Biological evidence found on the tool matched Jason's injuries, and Karen's fingerprints were on the handle. Karen's phone records revealed another layer to the story. In the weeks leading up to Jason's death, she had contacted a private investigator and a lawyer, fueling suspicions of premeditation. The financial records provided further insight. Jason had taken out a secret life insurance policy on Karen, worth a substantial sum, and his mounting debts hinted at a possible motive for both tension and conflict in their marriage. For investigators, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture, but without Karen's whereabouts, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. A statewide search ensued, with authorities scouring motels, bus stations, and rental records. After weeks of dead ends, Karen was finally located living under an assumed name in a small, nondescript motel in a neighboring town. She had been paying in cash and keeping a low profile, but a tip from a sharp-eyed motel clerk led the police to her door. Karen was arrested without incident. She maintained her composure as officers placed her in handcuffs, and when questioned, she denied any involvement in Jason's death. "It was an accident," she insisted. "I didn't do it. I wasn't even there when it happened." Forensic evidence, however, tied her to the garden tool found at the scene. Neighbors testified about a loud argument the night before, and inconsistencies, including a shattered phone and scuff marks, pointed to foul play. The prosecution presented a timeline suggesting premeditation, while the defense argued years of psychological abuse drove her actions. The jury found Karen guilty and sentenced her to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years.